Ukraine, more artillery and ammunition, counter battery radars, additional ammunition for the HIMARS multiple launch rocket systems we've already given Ukraine, and more HIMARS coming from other countries as well. We also welcome for the first time our partners in the Indo-Pacific to participate in the NATO summit. As I indicated to Putin, his action would cause worldwide response. Bringing together democratic allies and partners from the Atlantic and the Pacific to focus on the challenges that matter to our future and to defend the rules-based order against the challenges, including from China. In the G7 in Germany, we also launched what started off to be the Build Back Better notion, but it's morphed into the Partnership for Global Infrastructure and Investment to offer developing and middle-income countries better options to meet their urgent infrastructure needs. Because when the United States and G7 countries put skin in the game, it helps bring millions of dollars up to, before it's all over, up to possibly $1 trillion of private sector money off the sidelines. $600 billion in just the next few years. Unlike China, these projects will be done transparently and with very high standards. For example, the U.S. government just facilitated a new partnership between two American firms and the government of Angola to invest $2 billion building a significant solar project in Angola. It's a partnership that will help Angola meet its climate goals and energy needs while creating new markets for American technologies and good jobs in Angola. As you heard me say before, when I think climate, I think jobs. And the G7 also said we'd work together to take on China's abusive and coercive trade practices and rid our supply chains of products made with forced labor. We task our teams to work on the details of the price cap on Russian oil to drive down Putin's revenues without hurting Americans and others at the gas pump. We'll seek to use the funds from the tariffs on Russian goods to help Ukraine rebuild. We've committed more than $4.5 billion, more than half of that from the United States, to address food insecurity and the immediate crisis caused by the Russian war. At every step of this trip, we set down a marker of unity, determination, and deep capabilities of the democratic nations of the world to do what need be done. Putin thought he could break the transatlantic alliance. He tried to weaken us. He expected our resolve to fracture, but he's getting exactly what he did not want. He wanted the Finlandization of NATO. He got the NATOization of Finland. Just think about this. That's what he thought. Now NATO and Sweden are closer than ever to joining, and this will occur. We're more united than ever. And with the addition of Finland and Sweden, we'll be stronger than ever. They have serious militaries, both of them. We're going to increase the NATO border by 800 miles along the Finnish-Russian border. Sweden is all in. The point is, we're meeting the goals I set out when the first G7 meeting. We're moving to a place that reflects the realities of the second quarter of the 21st century. And we're on the verge of making significant progress. Now I'll be happy to take your questions. And the first question, I'm told, is Darlene Superville from the Associated Press.
Thank you, Mr. President. 2 questions, please.
Of course.
America is back was your motto at the first NATO summit last year, and you've come to this summit here and the one in Germany after the U.S. Supreme Court overturned constitutional protections for abortion, after the shootings in Buffalo and Texas, at a time of record inflation, and as new polling this week shows that 85% of the U.S. public thinks the country is going in the wrong direction. How do you explain this to those people who feel the country is going in the wrong direction, including some of the leaders you've been meeting with this week, who think that when you put all of this together, it amounts to an America that is going backward?
They do not think that. You haven't found one person one world leader to say America's going backwards. America's better positioned to lead the world than we ever have been. We have the strongest economy in the world. Our inflation rates are lower than other nations in the world. The one thing that has been destabilizing is the outrageous behavior of the Supreme Court of the United States on overruling not only Roe v. Wade, but essentially challenging the right to privacy. We've been a leader in the world in terms of personal rights and privacy rights, and it is a mistake, in my view, for the Supreme Court to do what it did. But I have not seen anyone come up to me do anything other than, nor have you heard them say anything other than, thank you for America's leadership. You've changed the dynamic of NATO and the G7. So I can understand why the American people are frustrated because of what the Supreme Court did. I can understand why the American people are frustrated because of inflation. But inflation is higher in almost every other country. Prices at the pump are higher in almost every other country. We're better positioned to deal with this than anyone, but we have a way to go. And the Supreme Court, we have to change that decision by codifying Roe v. Wade.
There were some comments by some of your counterparts after the U.S. Supreme Court ruling. But my second question is, G7 leaders this week pledged to support Ukraine, quote, for as long as it takes. And I'm wondering if you would explain what that means to the American people, for as long as it takes. Does it mean indefinite support from the United States for Ukraine? Or will there come a time when you have to say to President Zelensky that the United States cannot support his country any longer? Thank you.
We are going to support Ukraine as long as it takes. Look at the impact that the war on Ukraine has had on Russia. They've had to renege on their national debt for the first time since the beginning, almost well over 100 years. They've lost 15 years of the gains they made in terms of their economy. They're in a situation where they're having trouble because of my imposition of dealing with what can be exported to Russia in terms of technology. They can't even, they're going to have trouble maintaining oil production because they don't have the technology to do it. They need American technology. And they're also in a similar situation in terms of their weapon systems and some of their military systems. So they're paying a very, very heavy price for this. And just today, Snake Island is now taken over by the Ukrainians. So we are going to stick with Ukraine, and all of the alliance are going to stick with Ukraine as long as it takes to, in fact, make sure that they are not defeated by Ukraine. In Ukraine by Russia. And by the way, think of this. Ukraine has already dealt a severe blow to Russia. Russia, in fact, has already lost its international standing. Russia's in a position where the whole world's looking and saying, wait a minute, all this effort, you tried to take the whole country, you tried to take Kyiv, you lost. You've tried to take the Donbass and all of it. You haven't done that yet. The generic point is that we're supplying them with the capacity and the overwhelming courage they've demonstrated that, in fact, they can continue to resist the Russian aggression. And so I don't know how it's going to end, but it will not end with a Russian defeat of Ukraine in Ukraine. I'm supposed to go down the list here. Jim Tankersley, New York Times.
Mr. President, thank you. This week, you and the G7 allies introduced a plan for an oil price cap for Russian exports, which is not yet filled out, and obviously is a response to the high price of gasoline in the United States and around the world. Are you confident that that cap would bring down prices for American drivers? And how long is it fair to expect American drivers to continue to pay a premium because of this war?
Let me hear this. The second part of the question was, would it bring down the price?
Will it bring down prices? And the war has pushed prices up. They could go as high as $200 a barrel, some analysts think. How long is it fair to expect American drivers and drivers around the world to pay that premium for this war?
As long as it takes. So Russia cannot, in fact, defeat Ukraine and move beyond Ukraine. This is a critical, critical position for the world. Here we are. Why do we have NATO? I told Putin that, in fact, if he were to move, we would move to strengthen NATO. We would move to strengthen NATO across the board. Look, let me explain the price. I suggested a while ago that what we should consider doing is putting a cap on the amount of money that we would pay for, the world would pay for Russian oil, and that we would not provide, the West provides insurance, would not insure Russian ships carrying oil. We would not provide insurance for them, so they would have great difficulty getting customers. The point is that we've said to them, here's the deal. We're going to allow you to have a profit on what you make, but not the exorbitant prices that you're charging for the oil now. We've delegated a commission, a group of our national security people to sit down and work out that mechanism. We think it can be done. We think it can be done, and it would drive down the price of oil, and it would drive down the price of gasoline as well. In addition, at home, I have also called for changes. I've released 1 million barrels of oil per day from our oil reserve, and in addition to getting other nations to move forward, a total of 240 million barrels of oil to release from the Strategic Petroleum Reserve, number one. Number two, I've asked Congress, would they in fact go and temporarily end the tax on gasoline at the pump? And thirdly, to ask the states to do the same thing. If we do these things, it's estimated we could bring down tomorrow, if Congress agreed and the states agreed, we could bring down the price of oil about $1 a gallon at the pump, in that range. And so we could have immediate relief in terms of the reduction of the elimination of temporary elimination of the gas tax. And so I think there's a lot of things we can do and we will do, but the bottom line is, ultimately, the reason why gas prices are up is because of Russia. Russia. The reason why the food crisis exists is because of Russia. Russia not allowing grain to get out of Ukraine. And so that's the way in which I think we should move, and I think it would have a positive impact on the price at the pump as well. Jordan Fabian, Bloomberg.
Thank you, Mr. President. Thank you, Mr. President. I also have two questions for you.
Of course.
Thanks. The first one is on Turkey. What assurances, if any, did you make to President Erdogan about his request for new F-16 jets for his military?
What I said was, I said back in December, as you'll recall, we should sell them the F-16 jets and modernize those jets as well. It's not in our interest not to do that, and I indicated to them that I've not changed my position at all since December. And there was no quid pro quo with that. It was just that we should sell. But I need congressional approval to be able to do that, and I think we can get that.
And my second question is on your trip to Saudi Arabia, which is coming up next month. As we just discussed, Americans are paying almost $5 a gallon nationally on average for gas. So do you expect to ask the Crown Prince or the King to increase oil production? And if so, how will you balance that with your desire to hold them accountable for their human rights abuses?
Well, first of all, that's not the purpose of the trip. The purpose of the trip, first of all, I'm starting off on that trip in Israel. And the Israelis believe it's really important that I make the trip. In addition to that, what we're trying to do is the G7, it's the Gulf states plus 3. And so I'm sure that is in Saudi Arabia, but it's not about Saudi Arabia. It's in Saudi Arabia. And so there's no commitment that is being made, or I'm not even sure. I guess I will see the king and the crown prince, but that's not the meeting I'm going to. They'll be part of a much larger meeting. And what we're talking about in dealing with that trip is that before I go, I'm, as I said, going to Israel to meet with the Israeli leaders to affirm the unbreakable bond Israel and the United States have. And part of the purpose is the trip to the Middle East is to deepen Israel's integration into the region, which I think we're going to be able to do, and which is good for peace and good for Israeli security. And that's why Israel leaders have come out so strongly for my going to Saudi. But the overall piece here is we're also going to try to reduce the deaths and the war that's occurring. I mean, there's a whole range of things that go well beyond anything having to do with Saudi in particular.
But if you were to see the crown prince or the king, would you ask them to increase oil production? No,
I'm not going to ask. I'm going to ask. All the Gulf states are meeting. I've indicated to them that I thought they should be increasing oil production generically, not to the Saudis particularly. And I think I hope we see them in their own interest concluding that makes sense to do. And, they have real concerns about what's going on in Iran and other places in terms of their security as well, all of them. Tarina, the Wall Street Journal.
Thank you, Mr. President. I'm going to keep the trend and also ask two questions, if that's okay. One on the summit and one domestic question. On the summit, you just said that there would be another round of security assistance for Ukraine. After hearing President Zelensky's assessment that the war needs to end before the winter, are you changing your calculation in terms of the pace of the assistance and what kind of assistance you're sending to Ukraine?
No, the war could end tomorrow, by the way, if Russia stops its irrational behavior. So, when the war will end, I hope it ends sooner than later. But for it to end, they have to be in a position where the Ukrainians have all that they can reasonably expect, we can reasonably expect to get to them in order to provide for their physical security and their defenses. And so one does not relate to the other. They need, we're going to be providing another, well, I guess I'll announce it shortly, but another $800 million in aid for additional weaponry, including, weapons, including air defense system, as well as offensive weapons. I have a whole list I'd be happy to give to you, but that's the next tranche that's going to occur.
And on the domestic question, sir, what further specific executive actions are you considering in response to the Roe ruling? And would you declare a public health emergency, as several Democrats are calling on you to do?
I'll be happy to go in detail with you on that. I'm having a meeting with a group of governors when I get home on Friday, and I'll have announcements to make then. But the first and foremost thing we should do is make it clear how outrageous this decision was and how much it impacts not just on woman's right to choose, which is a critical piece, but on privacy generally. And so I'm going to be talking to the governors as to what actions they think I should be taking as well. And but the most important thing to be clear about is we have to change. I believe we have to codify Roe v. Wade in the law, and the way to do that is to make sure the Congress votes to do that. And if the filibuster gets in the way, it's like voting rights. It should be we provide an exception for this. Require an exception to the filibuster for this action to deal with the Supreme Court decision. Hang on, I got one more here. Kelly O'Donnell, NBC.
Thank you, Mr. President. Well, you just made some news saying you would support changing the filibuster rules to codify abortion rights broadly across the country.
Right to privacy is not just abortion rights, but yes, abortion rights.
Can you describe for us, sir, many Americans are grappling with this. What is your sense today about the integrity and the impartiality of the Supreme Court? Should Americans have confidence in the court as an institution? And your views on abortion have evolved in your public life. Are you the best messenger to carry this forward when Democrats, many of them, many progressives, want you to do more?
Yeah, I am. I'm the President of the United States of America. That makes me the best messenger. And I really think that it's a serious problem that the court has thrust upon the United States, not just in terms of the right to choose, but in terms of the right to who you can marry, a whole range of issues relating to privacy. And I have written way back a number of law review articles about the Ninth Amendment and the 14th Amendment and why the privacy is considered as part of a constitutional guarantee. And they've just wiped it all out. And so I'm the only president they got, and I feel extremely strongly that I'm going to do everything in my power, which I legally can do in terms of executive orders, as well as push the Congress and the public. The bottom line here is, if you care, if the polling data is correct, and you think this decision by the court was an outrage or a significant mistake, vote. Show up and vote. Vote in the off year and vote, vote, vote. That's how we'll change it. All right, guys. No, there's no such thing as a quick one. I'm out of here. Thank you all very much.
Always leave them wanting more.
That's
right?
exactly what he did. The president in Madrid, Spain, as the NATO summit wraps up, taking questions on both domestic issues, but also what happened at the NATO summit. The purpose of the NATO summit was to hammer out their strategic concept. The president said something really interesting at the beginning of his speech. He said the last time he did that was like 12 years ago. And at that point, Russia was described as a partner.
Right.
And China wasn't even mentioned.
Right.
This time around, Russia was described as the most significant and direct threat. And the relationship between Russia and China is seen as a challenge to the world order.
Right. And that challenge is growing because, as you know, the United States has encouraged other nations to join the NATO alliance, and that is happening. There's an expansion of NATO happening, which is kind of ironic because President Putin of Russia, part of his strategy in invading Ukraine was because of his fear of an expansionist NATO, and directly as a result, because of his invasion of Ukraine, NATO is expanding, and even Turkey, which had objected to the expansion of NATO, has now agreed. And so now what you're seeing, and this is what we're going to talk to Nancy Cordes about in just a little bit, is that these leaders at the G7 are explaining to the world what their policies are going to be as they expand NATO, as they provide more weapons and more money to Ukraine for their defense. But they still have to sell that message at home. Not just President Biden, but all of the North Atlantic Treaty Organization partners have to go back to their countries and explain to people why this is an imperative. Because there is a little bit, sadly, tragically, if you will, of fatigue in some of these countries. They're dealing with skyrocketing inflation, high fuel prices, and there's a lot of domestic issues, not just in the United States, but in the G7 countries as well. And now you're asking them to also bear the burden of helping Ukraine defend itself. So that's part of the messaging that the president is trying to get out.
And I think you're right, which is why you had to answer some questions on domestic issues, including gas prices. But we're talking about Sweden and Finland joining the NATO alliance. And the difference between them and maybe another country is they already have beefed up militaries.
Right.
They've already been contributing the required, I think is it 2%, whatever, to their own military.
Yes.
So not only is NATO expanding in terms of 2 more members and expanding its real estate, but the military might is also expanding significantly as well with the addition of Sweden and Finland. I was talking to Nancy Cordes earlier, right?
Yeah.
Vlad, and I thought to myself, and I said to her, what a difference a year makes. You remember President Trump saying, well, NATO is obsolete, right?
Yeah.
It's without purpose. And so here we have NATO, as you point out, sort of fulfilling Russia's Putin's fear.
Right.
Becoming not obsolete, but even more necessary than it was just a year ago.
Right. And Anne-Marie, it's such an interesting point. That actually is a brilliant point, because that is one of the biggest issues facing the North Atlantic Treaty Organization right now. And we have video, I think, of President Putin making a speech talking about what Russia's response is going to be to this not only expansion of NATO, but also the United States beefing up its military presence in Western Europe, right? President Putin, exactly. President Putin is saying, well, if that's what the United States is going to do, we will act accordingly. What does that mean? This is that video of President Putin. I guess he's talking to either members of the press in Russia about that very notion, that Russia is going to respond in kind. And so remember when we were kids, MAD, mutually assured destruction? We're not there yet, because we're not talking about nuclear weapons, but this escalation, this tit for tat is reminiscent of Cold War tactics that were used with the old Soviet Union and the United States, right? Where the United States puts missiles, in Turkey, and the Russians decide that they're going to put or attempt to put missiles in the Caribbean, in Cuba. That's where we are right now, where we're starting to see this escalation of Cold War tactics in 2022.
Yeah, and so you pointed out earlier that, all of these leaders have to go back and sell this concept to their own constituents, because everyone's dealing with a lot of domestic issues. And the president was asked about two of the biggies, right? Gas prices. What is his plan to do when it comes to gas prices? And of course, the reaction to the overturning of Roe v. Wade. We've heard some of his strategies already when it comes to gas prices. He wants, a release of oil from the strategic oil reserves. He wants a tax holiday at the federal and the state level. He says if Congress will approve both of those things, then gas prices will come down by a whole $1. But of course, the counter argument is, well, what happens when the tax holiday goes away and everything jumps right back up again? Right? So that's the counter offer and the counter argument, and then of course reaction to Roe v. Wade, right? And what he said was that he would support a change in the filibuster rules if it meant that there would be codification of access to abortion. Right.
He said he would try to do whatever he could within his legal means. There are executive actions that he could take. I thought it was very interesting, and I want to ask Nancy Cordes about that. I can actually see her getting mic'd up now. And I wanted to snap a picture of that, because it's a remarkable photo of Nancy getting ready, rushing from the briefing room to the live shot position. But the president said that when he gets back to the United States, he's going to be meeting with governors to talk about ways that they can. He didn't use the word get around, but ways that they can make access to abortion for those who want it easier for people, especially in states where those restrictions are going into place, where abortion will be completely outlawed. And there are a couple of states that are doing that. Almost half of the United States have these laws where they're going to make abortion illegal outright. So that'll be interesting to hear what comes out of those meetings with governors that the president is scheduled to have. The other thing that was interesting, Anne-Marie, was Saudi Arabia. He was asked questions about Saudi Arabia. So I'm going to get Nancy Cordes to talk about that, because a lot of people are wondering about whether he'll meet with MBS. And what will that mean for oil? Because obviously Saudi Arabia is a major oil producer. And the question is, will the president ask the Saudis for an increase in oil production?
He says he's not going over there for that.
He says it's in Saudi Arabia. It's not about Saudi Arabia. So let us bring in Nancy Cordes, our chief White House correspondent, who has been covering the summit in Madrid. Nancy, thank you so much for your hustle. I know that it was, probably a bit of a walk from where the president was to your live shot position. We thank you very, very much.
It was.
So talk to us about your takeaways from what the president just said to you.
Well, I thought it was interesting how far he was willing to go on the abortion issue. Typically when he is here overseas at a summit of this kind, he would much prefer to talk about international issues, foreign affairs, the types of issues that he's dealing with here on foreign soil. And certainly he did talk a lot about Russia and Ukraine, and we can get into that. But it was on abortion where he really made some news and said that he would support either eliminating or changing filibuster rules in the Senate in order to pass a law codifying the right to an abortion. And he went even further than that and said, actually, he'd be willing to change the filibuster rules when it comes to privacy rights more generally. And what he means by that are not just a constitutional right to abortion, but also other things like contraception and same-sex marriage and interracial marriage, which is something that a lot of Democrats worry might now be on the chopping block after the Supreme Court decision that we saw last week.
Yeah, and of course, if people remember the decision, Justice Alito said, well, you know, access to abortion is completely different than these other things because access to abortion is about the life of a fetus. But then he never explained legally why that was radically different. And that made people very concerned. And of course, Justice Thomas argued that, hey, maybe we should revisit all of these issues that are connected to the right to privacy, except for interracial marriage. Yes, but I digress. Let us talk about what the gathering was all about. Front and center was, of course, Russia's invasion of Ukraine. The president was asked about whether or not the U.S. would continue to help Ukraine throughout Russia's invasion. What did he say? He said something, as long as it takes.
Right.
What does that mean, right?
It's very open-ended.
Yeah.
Right. And the reason he was asked that question is because, look, the American people and really people around the world are suffering as a result of this war. They are paying much higher fuel prices. They are paying higher food prices. And so that does lead to a question about how long countries around the world are going to have the resolve to stand by Ukraine, the underdog, if it means that their citizens are going to be paying a lot more. And the president reiterated, look, that's just the price that people are going to have to pay. It is too important to stand up to Russia in this instance, because if we don't, it'll embolden Russia to try to take territory elsewhere. And so he acknowledged the costs that people are experiencing. He talked about the fact that he and some of the other world leaders that he's been meeting with here are working on a nascent idea to cap oil prices if they can in some way, but that is it's still very unclear how they would do that and how it would work. But he says they're looking for ways to try to address high fuel prices. But for anyone who is hoping that perhaps we will, abandon Ukraine in the interest of lowering gas prices quickly, the president made it clear in that press conference it's not going to happen.
Yeah, and it's such an interesting question, Anne-Marie and Nancy, because the reality of it is Russia can keep going. I mean, people thought the sanctions were going to have crippling effects. We know that the ruble has rebounded. We know that it doesn't appear, as you watch Vladimir Putin give his press conferences, that he is particularly worried. I know it's a public face that he's putting on for the cameras, but the reality is he can go on much longer than these Western countries can stand. You've got President Zelensky, Nancy, suggesting that, at least the New York Times reporting, that he needs about $5 billion a month to just maintain the defensive strategy that he has right now. As you know, Nancy, NATO is increasing its troop presence on its eastern flank by about 260,000. So you've got that component of the trying to contain Russian aggression. How is the president going to manage that both abroad and back home?
Right. I mean, what he tried to argue in this press conference, and he's tried to say this before as well at home, I'm not sure how much it sinks in, but, he argues that inflation and gas prices are actually worse here in Europe and in other places around the world than they are back home. Certainly, when it comes to fuel prices, it is an even bigger problem here because so many European countries relied so heavily on Russia for oil and natural gas. And it's difficult for them to change on a dime and to start counting on other sources for that oil and natural gas. So they're really feeling the pain here. At the same time, he tried to argue that when he goes to Saudi Arabia in a couple of weeks, that somehow getting them to produce more oil is not at the top of his agenda. Well, that's just, not realistic to say. The reality is that he is taking a public relations hit by going to Saudi Arabia in the first place because it is such a high priority for this administration to figure out ways to bring down the price of oil. And one of the best ways to do that is to convince other major suppliers of oil to increase that supply. And interestingly, when he gave that answer about Saudi Arabia, that was the one time that he stood at the podium and kind of looked down at his notes, sort of the prepared bullet points points that he had been given by his staff. You notice he was doing something a little different at this press conference. He had a hand microphone after he delivered his prepared remarks and kind of, walked back and forth along the stage. That's a format that he's very comfortable with, obviously. But when it came to questions about Saudi Arabia in particular, he went back to the podium, clearly had some notes jotted down, either that he had jotted down or his staff had jotted down. And he tried to argue, interestingly, that even though he's going to Saudi Arabia, he's not really expressly meeting with the king or the crown prince. He said sort of, I guess they'll be there. They'll probably be there when I meet with all of the Gulf states in this meeting, really trying to downplay the level of engagement he is going to have with the crown prince in particular, who he has said in the past should be a pariah because of human rights abuses, including his involvement in the killing of Washington Post journalist Jamal Khashoggi. But it's laughable to suggest that you're going to a host country and that you're not going to meaningfully engage with the leaders of that host country. Just look at Spain as an example. The president stepped off the plane here in Spain. What's the first thing he did? He met with the King of Spain, and he met with the political leader of Spain. That's just typical. And the Saudis say that he's actually going to be spending quite a bit of one-on-one time with the Crown Prince in particular, and that they're going to discuss a range of bilateral issues.
Nancy, really quickly before we let you go, we've been talking about, Ukraine and Russia, but China was also a major focus here. The president said in the last strategic concept, China wasn't even mentioned at all. Other than China's relationship with Russia, what were the key concerns for NATO?
There are a host of concerns that led NATO to label China for the first time in this strategic concept as an ongoing challenge for this alliance. And that's really significant because if you think about it, NATO was created to deal with Russia. It was created during the Cold War. China was really not in the picture. So the fact that the North Atlantic Treaty Organization is now singling out China is really significant. And there are a number of things that led to this decision. I mean, first of all, there is the close and enduring relationship between China and Russia. Their attempts, according to alliance leaders, to undercut the rules-based world order, which NATO says is contrary to its values. It's the fact that there are state-sponsored cyber attacks taking place by Chinese actors around the world, threats to neighbors like Taiwan, crackdown on democracy in Hong Kong and elsewhere. There's a whole series of issues, including the expansion of China's military, that has NATO leaders very concerned.
All right, Nancy Cordes, we threw a bunch of questions at you. You're always great. Thank you so much,
Thanks,
Nancy.
Nancy.
You're welcome.
Well, slightly fewer Americans applied for unemployment benefits last week. The latest Labor Department report shows new filings fell to 231,000 for the week of June 25th. That's 2,000 fewer than the previous week. So with us now is Catherine Dill. She's a reporter covering careers and the workforce at the Wall Street Journal. All right, let's dig into the numbers. First-time jobless claims